So, after 10 years, several false starts, 53 hours and 30 minutes, I have finally played The Witcher Enhanced Edition beginning to end. And honestly, despite one or two issues I'll get into later, I really enjoyed it, and it holds up surprisingly well for a game released in 2008. And yes, before you start commenting, I know The Witcher was originally released in 2007, but as I said, I played the Enhanced Edition, which, according to this handy document I found on the Wayback Machine, adds 2 new mods, these little side stories here, a level editor to make your own adventures, improved inventory, autosave, character differentiation, auto-looting, new gestures in dialogue and cutscenes, improved facial expressions, corrected English translation and voice work, reduced loading times, improved game stability, improved combat responsiveness, improved AI. You get the point. CD Projekt Red made a lot of improvements to the game since its initial release, a trend they've kept going to this day. But before I go into details, I'm going to throw up a spoiler warning here. I don't know what or how much I'm going to spoil, as I haven't gotten that far into the script yet, but I'm planning on going quite in depth. But look, the game's almost 13 years old. I'm guessing those of you watching the video fall into one of two groups. Those who have played it and like hearing other people's opinions, and those who haven't played it and don't really care, so I'll just get on with it. Also, if you're offended by lady nipples, especially the digital kind, firstly, grow the fuck up, and secondly, this probably isn't the video or game for you. And I should also probably mention that I haven't played The Witcher 2 or 3, so won't be making any comparisons to those games. I first heard of The Witcher around 2006, 2007, maybe? I had a friend called Rob who was well into martial arts and grimdark and low fantasy things, and he told me about this game coming out where you play as a warrior with white hair, and it's based on these books that aren't even out in English yet. And to be honest, it sounded really cool. Fast forward to Christmas 2007, I'm reading Games TM or Edge magazine or something like that, and there it was. A review for The Witcher, this fabled game that my friend told me about all those months earlier. So naturally I jumped online, did some searching, and found that yes, one of the books this game was based on had literally just 6 months before been translated into English. I was so excited I could barely contain myself. My girlfriend at the time worked in a bookshop and ordered me in a copy, and a few days later I was holding in my hand The Last Wish by Andrzej Sapkowski. I opened the cover, turned the page, and was introduced to the world of Geralt of Rivia, a man mutated with alchemy and magic whose sole purpose in life was to hunt monsters for coin. There was swearing and sex and violence, and to my then 22-year-old edgelord brain, it was the greatest thing I'd ever read. I just had to play this game. Unfortunately, I didn't have a PC powerful enough to run it, and to tell you the truth, I barely do now, so I read the book from cover to cover and dreamt of the day I'd be able to play The Witcher. Then, in 2008, my dreams were answered. Kind of. CD Projekt Red announced they were hard at work on a console version of the game called The Witcher Rise of the White Wolf for Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. This was the news I'd been waiting for. According to the announcement, Rise of the White Wolf was set to be released in autumn 2009. It was being developed by Widescreen Games and was essentially a from-the-ground-up remake with improved combat and a redesigned skill system. Sadly, this dream was never realised, as in May 2009, Rise of the White Wolf was cancelled indefinitely due to a fallout between CDPR and Widescreen. By this point, Blood of Elves had been translated into English, so it was back to the books and waiting until I had a PC good enough to run the newly released Enhanced Edition. Then, in 2011, I finally had a machine that could just about run it, and I made the purchase on GOG.com, played for an hour, realised I don't like playing games on PC, and turned it off. So, why am I telling you this story history? Honestly, because I want you to know how long a road it has been for me to finally play through The Witcher. What a personal achievement it is for me to see the credits roll after all this time. And how excited I am to finally be one step closer to being able to play The Witcher 3, because something in my brain won't let me start that until I finish the first two. But that's the history, now on to the game. The Witcher is an action RPG set around Vizima, the capital of Temeria. You play as Geralt of Rivia, a man mutated with magic and alchemy known as a Witcher, who accidentally has sex with almost every woman he meets. After seemingly being killed several years earlier, Geralt wakes up dazed and confused with amnesia. He is found by other Witchers and taken back to their home, Kaer Morhen, which is subsequently attacked, ransacked, and all the Witch's secrets and mutagens are stolen. Geralt heads to Vizima to track down the culprits and recover the stolen property, and as he does, a tale of political intrigue unfolds. Now, if you've just outwardly groaned at the amnesia plotline, you're not alone. We can all agree it's massively overdone, but here it kind of works. The game sets several years after the end of Sapkowski's novels, so it's safe to assume a lot of characters from the books turn up in the game, and they do. So the developers needed a way to introduce these already established characters to players who have not read the books. As I said, it only kind of works because the "who are you, I've lost my memory, oh, allow me to reintroduce myself" conversations are super clunky exposition dumps which probably would have worked better if the dialogue wasn't so awkward. The story is split into a prologue, 5 main chapters and an epilogue, each with their own story locations and side quests, but more on that later. There's an almost morality system in play too, where certain actions have consequences. It pretty much falls to a binary choice of this option or that option, but the genius of it is the consequences of those choices won't be revealed until hours later down the line. This adds real weight to the decisions you have to make, and honestly it stressed me the fuck out every time I came to one of those metaphorical forks in the road. For example, during the prologue, you can choose to help Triss or fight a monster called the Frightener. This decision isn't paid off until midway through chapter 1, where an encounter with the villains of the game changes slightly. By the end of the game, the entire city was ablaze. Former allies were giving me the cold shoulder or were outright enemies, and all but 2 NPCs were genuinely furious at me because I chose to zig instead of zag. It definitely lends itself to multiple playthroughs to see the other possibilities, and one day in the future I am definitely going to do that because I need to see if it's possible to not fuck absolutely everything up. All being said, the overarching story was fine, if not a little video game generic toward the end, but I definitely got more enjoyment out of some of the side quest stories. Gameplay in The Witcher is a mixture of exploration, combat, and a whole lot of talking. Combat is definitely one of the game's strongest elements. Admittedly, by today's standards it's janky as hell, but it kept me pushing forward through some of the more boring quests. It's all about which sword Geralt uses, which style he uses, and which potions he takes. One of the things I heard about The Witcher when it first came out was how complex and in-depth the combat system was, so I approached it with a bit of trepidation. Luckily, or disappointingly depending on how you look at it, combat in The Witcher isn't anywhere near as complicated or complex as I was led to believe. Geralt has 2 swords, steel for man and silver for monsters, and each sword has 3 styles: strong for big enemies, fast for small enemies, and group for when he's surrounded. Clicking on an enemy will make Geralt draw his sword and take a style stance before attacking, and swords and styles can be changed in real time with the stroke of a key. When Geralt begins his attack animation, clicking the left mouse button again when the crossed out sword icon changes to a flaming sword icon will allow him to start a combo. And that's pretty much all there is to melee combat. It then comes down to a task of watching your surroundings and making sure you're using the right sword and the right style. I think a lot of the myth of The Witcher's complex combat system comes down to if you use the wrong sword or style, you can get killed pretty quickly. You can also pick up and equip sidearms, such as knives and axes, but to be honest, with the exception of a sword I found that had a damage buff to humans, I didn't use them at all. A big part of The Witcher's combat comes down to enhancing Geralt's combat ability through taking potions. This was one of the big draws for me when I first heard about the game's combat, and a part of what made it sound so complicated. In theory, taking the right potions for the right fights can be the difference between a quick death and living to fight another day. But the reality of it is occasionally taking a swallow potion to restore health at an increased rate over time, and a blizzard potion to increase Geralt's evasion, and that got me through pretty much every big encounter in the game. You can double tap the movement keys to dodge too, but to be honest, the right potions and correct style are far more effective. Geralt also has 5 magic spells at hand called signs that can push and stun enemies, set them on fire, create a shield around himself, brainwash small enemies, and lay a damaging trap on the ground. It's a shame then that you only need Ard, the sign that pushes enemies away from you, and Igni, the sign that is essentially a flamethrower. Once these are leveled up, they become completely overpowered. Ard can eventually stun small and mid-sized enemies, which Geralt can then kill in one hit, and Igni just incinerates absolutely everything. Once I'd figured this out, every combat encounter was an absolute breeze. Leveling up in The Witcher's pretty standard fare. You get EXP for killing enemies and completing quests, eventually gaining a level. Leveling up skills and attributes can only be done when meditating at a fireplace, and there was times when I'd be so engrossed in the quest chain I was in, I'd forget to level up completely. When you level up, you gain talent points, bronze at first, then later on silver and gold. These can be used to improve Geralt's attributes like strength and stamina, make his sign stronger, and improve his swordsmanship. And although by the end of the game, pretty much everything is maxed out, during the run up to that point, there's quite a lot of freedom for you to level up Geralt according to your playstyle. Each chapter takes place in locations that are contained to that particular chapter, but you're pretty much free to explore as you like. Active quests are listed in your Witcher's journal, and quests that can be continued or handed in are marked with a star that can be actively tracked on your map. Annoyingly, I was about 25 hours into the game before I figured this out and had wasted so much time aimlessly wandering around looking for something to do. I probably could have shaved a good 10 hours off my completion time if I'd figured this out earlier. Anyway, while playing, I kept referring to The Witcher as quote-unquote busy work the game. You spend a lot of time at the beginning of a new chapter running around, talking to NPCs to try and find Witcher's work, taking jobs from the notice board outside the inn, and generally getting your bearings. Something else I didn't realise until much later on was, despite the fact you can view quests by chapter in the journal, that doesn't mean you can only do them in that chapter. A lot of quests carry over to the following chapters, and in fact some can only be completed in later chapters. Not knowing this made playing through chapter 2 so stressful I almost gave up on the whole adventure. With the exception of the overall find the baddie and get your next stuff back quests, the prologue has quests that can only be completed during the prologue due to its setting. I'm pretty sure this is the same with chapter 1, which takes place outside the walls of Vizima, as I wasn't able to get back to that area once I was inside the city, but I'm not sure if I was just trying at the wrong time of day, so that's by the by. I assume then that this would be the case for every chapter going forward, but from chapter 2 onward, most of the side quests you find can be carried over to other chapters, with some not being completable until chapter 5. It's a fine system in a completely open world game, sure, but it's real shitty in a game that's spread out over different chapters and locations. And knowing this going in would have made certain parts of The Witcher a lot less tedious and far more enjoyable for me than they ended up being. A huge part of exploration is ingredient acquisition. As mentioned earlier, Geralt takes potions to enhance his combat ability, but these potions aren't bought, they're made. To do so, you'll have various alcohols to act as a potion base, and whatever ingredients the potion recipe asks for. To be able to find these ingredients, you first need to unlock herbalism and monster lore from the intelligence skill tree, then find or buy various books and scrolls throughout the world to fill out the ingredients and monster sections of the journal. And certain entries to these sections are also filled in by fighting the monsters and then meditating, but it's never clear how much is unlocked through fighting and how much is unlocked through reading. Then, you'll have to find the ingredients by pillaging the bodies of monsters or by picking flowers. Honestly, it's a bit of an ordeal having to jump through so many hoops, and it's especially annoying when you have a side quest to collect a particular item from a monster, but you haven't unlocked the entry for that monster in the journal yet, so you can't actually farm the item you need, so instead you have to run around trying to track down a vendor who sells a book with knowledge of that monster, or raid every cupboard in every house you come across in the vague hope that one of the residents of Vizima has a copy of the book you need. And then, once you have the book, you have to right click to read the book, then it's stuck in your inventory until you find an inn to store it in or a vendor to sell it back to for a huge loss. Or you could just drop it on the floor. I understand why they've done it this way. Geralt has amnesia. He wouldn't remember which monster parts or particular leaves would be right for brewing a potion, but the micromanagement of collect the book, read the book, hold the book, drop the book can get tedious at times, especially when you've just collected a library's worth. I get CDPR were probably going for some kind of realism in the steps you need to take to make the experience more immersive, but I'd have much preferred a system like collect the book in the journal automatically updates without taking up any space in the inventory. As for brewing the potions themselves, that's actually really simple. You meditate at a fireplace, select the alchemy tab, and select whatever potion you want to make from the formula selection, provided you have the ingredients needed, and click mix. Considering how round the houses some of the systems in The Witcher are, I was genuinely surprised and thankful to see that the alchemy itself was so streamlined. The world of The Witcher is difficult to describe. It's open, but within limitations. Each chapter takes place in a handful of different connected locales that Geralt is, for the most part, free to explore. These areas are chapter specific and to my knowledge can't be visited again once the chapter is complete, with the exceptions of chapters 2 and 3 which share areas. The world's bleak and melancholy, with a heavy atmosphere of impending doom that can be almost suffocating at times. But at the same time there's a strange, peaceful beauty to it. A lot of the NPC models and voices are recycled time and again, which would sometimes take me out of the experience. Although an essential part of development in order to keep the game size from ballooning, seeing the same model used for a story important NPC being reused several times to fill up space in the town square can be jarring at times, and hilarious at others. The entire game takes place in and around Vizima, and although the areas at first seem vast, it doesn't take long to realise how small they actually are. Luckily, they are full to the brim of things to do. You have your standard kill and collect side quests, a game of dice poker that is super simple, crazy addictive, and far more fun than it has any right to be. There are bare knuckle boxing matches to take part in the inns you visit, special monsters to slay and trophies to hand in for a reward, and a whole bunch of women to seduce and sleep with. And that final extracurricular activity is a good example of a place where The Witcher unfortunately falls flat. The books the world and characters of this game are based on was released between 1992 and 1999, which, as anyone who grew up in the 90s knows, was a very different time as far as what was deemed to be socially acceptable attitudes toward women. Long story short, misogyny is rampant in The Witcher, and as much as my 22-year-old edgelord brain would have found it funny or even cool in 2007, my 36-year-old brain with a girlfriend and a mortgage finds it really fucking cringy. The quote-unquote romance in The Witcher is hilariously awful thanks to some truly terrible writing and voice performances. Oftentimes when Geralt is talking to a female character of some import, for no reason whatsoever, a cheesy pickup line will appear as a dialogue option and a suggested sex scene will play out after selecting it. Then, to really drive home the idea of women as objects, Geralt receives an illustrated card of his latest conquest, and if you're wondering how many titty cards I collected, the answer is 11. I want to talk about the individual chapters now because there's something of a mixed bag. The prologue takes place in the Witcher home of Kaer Morhen and acts as a tutorial. It introduces the basics of combat and alchemy, gives an example of the choice system that's in play, gives you your first sign, and sets up the events of the game nicely. I actually really enjoy this chapter, which is fortunate because of all the different times that I've started this game, I have played through the prologue so many times, I know it like the back of my hand. Chapter 1 takes place in the outskirts of Vizima, and now I'm thinking about it, it's kind of a brilliant tutorial in its own right. There's one main field to explore and a couple of caves and crypts. It introduces inns and notice board quests, and really eases you into what a Witcher is. There's a self-contained story for the chapter about the village being terrorised by a beast, so it's your job as the Witcher to figure out what's going on. At this point in the game, Geralt only has his steel sword, but he's also only fighting monsters, so unless you're using the systems correctly, it can be really tough at times, and it's a good way of introducing the idea of certain weapons being used for certain enemies before giving you the choice to do so. It's just a really fun area to play around in and easily one of my favourites in the game. Chapter 2, however, is fucking terrible. Geralt takes on the role of a private investigator trying to find out who in town is in league with the Salamandra, the villains of the story. It's the first chapter to be made up of multiple areas, and things got overwhelming for me real quick. There was far too much time spent backtracking and huge chunks of time when nothing happened. At one point, Geralt is tasked with finding 10 stones to place in obelisks to open the doors to a magic tower, and for some reason, most of them appeared in my inventory out of thin air. Pretty soon, all I had to do was find the final stone, which I spent hours looking for, only to receive it as a reward for another seemingly unrelated quest. It's a really messy quest chain, and I was so glad when it was over. Chapter 2 is also home to possibly the worst quest in any game I have ever played. One of Geralt's friends, Shani, is having a party, and Geralt is tasked with supplying alcohol and inviting a friend. Once the party begins, the story comes to a complete standstill as the characters in question sit around getting drunk and talking utter bollocks. As if this pause in the action wasn't bad enough, Geralt is then tasked with going downstairs and recovering an item for the guest. Now, The Witcher is one of those games with a quote-unquote drunk state in it, where the screen goes blurry and the player character stumbles about at half walking speed. I hate this. I absolutely hate it. Not just in this game, but in any game. It's a shit mechanic, it's frustrating to play, and The Witcher makes you do it a lot. It nosedives from novelty to annoyance after the second time it happens, so I was truly seething at this point. And it was made worse here by the fact that after I'd finally gotten downstairs and collected the quest item, I was subsequently kicked out of the house by the landlord for being drunk and wasn't allowed back in. So I was supposed to stumble to a safe house to meditate and sober up. And that would have taken so long. But luckily, The Witcher is broken, and if Geralt draws his sword while drunk, he's able to move at a normal pace, and if you choose to have him in a quick style, he runs faster than normal. But yeah, this quest's awful. It also introduces us to Dandelion, the most annoying character in the game. I fucking hate this guy. I hate his face, his costume, his non-stop talking, and after this mission he becomes a regular feature in the story, and I groaned every time he showed up. I don't remember him being this annoying in the books, but oh my days, I wish I could kill him and move on. Chapter 2 dragged on far longer than it should have and massively outstayed its welcome. Admittedly, a lot of the wasted time was down to me not fully understanding the game's systems, and I know if I were to play through it again I could finish the chapter in less than half the time, but the damage is already done. I do and will forever hate Chapter 2. Chapter 3 on the other hand is brilliant. I don't completely remember the story of it as there was a lot going on, but the quest seemed a lot tighter and streamlined than in Chapter 2. Plus, Geralt has an orgy with some vampires and then teams up with them to absolutely fuck up some knights immediately afterward. And that's a sentence I never thought I'd use, so I kinda love it. Chapter 4 is a weird one. It brings the plot to a screeching halt as Geralt ends up in a new area trying to solve a murder and take part in some self-reflection. It's a weird change of pace considering where Chapter 3 ends, to the point where it feels like a DLC that was shoehorned into the main campaign to bulk it out a bit and give some more variety to the locations. All in all, it's a pretty good self-contained chapter that really kicks off at the end, and that feeling of shit hitting the fan goes straight into Chapter 5. Because when Chapter 5 starts, Vizima is on fire and there's a war in the streets. For the first couple of hours there is no exploration at all, you're pretty much on rails being pushed forward the entire time. And when the chapter eventually does open up to allow exploration, it is the worst area of the game by far. I mean, look at this. I can't see where the fuck I'm going at all. Traversing this swamp is an actual nightmare. Part of the story for this chapter is fighting a Striga, which is a great throwback to the first story titled The Witcher in the book The Last Wish, and probably the reason the book was finally translated to English and released alongside the game. It's also the story from Season 1 Episode 3 of The Witcher on Netflix, and the intro movie to the game itself. The Striga fight is a great example of something working well on screen or on the page, and it not working in a game at all. So the Striga's curse is broken by spending the night close to the sarcophagus where it sleeps during the day, and during the intro it looks like this. During the Netflix show it looks like this. Game itself, it looks like this. It's a real anticlimactic end to that particular story, and sadly the story continues to decline from here as mutant enemy variants are introduced. But I got to fight a giant enemy crab, so I can't complain. The epilogue is basically just Chapter 5 Part 2. I got the impression that CDPR didn't really know how to end the story, so just threw the kitchen sink at it and hoped for the best. There's more mutants, an enemy gauntlet, and a boss that went down in seconds once I switched to the correct sword. You get a retelling of the decisions you made and what the consequences of your actions were, and I felt like I was being told off by a disappointed parent. Then Geralt disappears into the sunset and a sequel is set up with another impressive full motion video. And that's it. If I had to describe The Witcher in 3 words, it'd be brilliant but flawed. A lot of the ideas here are genuinely great, but the execution just isn't quite there for a lot of it. The combat's enjoyable, but missing something that would make it great. Same for the alchemy and potion use. and pretty much every system in the game. CD Projekt Red get a pass on this though, considering The Witcher was their first game. It's rough around the edges, but it's good enough. There were some funny bugs, my favourite being Geralt and another character Siegfried stopping mid-boss fight to repeat a conversation they had been having before entering the boss arena. And it crashed on me several times after extended play sessions, which was annoying, but not a deal breaker as the autosave function works pretty well. There were some massive performance issues when too many character models were on screen at once, and this led to several crashes, especially during the early stages of Chapter 5, which was a bit of a nightmare. I'm unsure how much of that was my PC versus the game's stability issues, but I was playing with the lowest settings and textures set to high, so it should have been playable on an Abacus. I mostly had a fantastic time playing The Witcher. My intention was to play it for a couple of hours a night over the month of January and take my time with it, but it quickly became an obsession. I'd sit at my desk any chance I could and just lose myself in its world. One day I stayed up till 6 AM playing it, then had to get up for work a couple of hours later, and it has been a long time since a game gripped me like that. It isn't perfect, and I have my complaints, but they all come from a place of love. And from here, I am genuinely excited to play The Witcher 2 and see what changes and improvements, if any, CDPR have made to the series. So yeah, The Witcher. Have you played it? What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Give us a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next video, whenever that may be.